take panel one at this time. Mr. Leo, thank you for coming. You're welcome. You may present your testimony.
Thank you very much, Representative Pitts, for calling this hearing and also for your leadership on the issue of freedom of religion and on human rights more generally.
Is your mic on? Just press so you see the green light. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I want to thank the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for convening this important hearing on challenges facing South Asia's religious minorities. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, on which I serve as chair, has monitored religious freedom conditions across the region for many years. Today, I will share USCIRF's findings and recommendations from our 2012 annual report, which we released yesterday, as they pertain to the region. Before I focus on USCIRF's findings and recommendations, though, I would like to take this opportunity to note that this is a significant week for our Commission, Representative Pitts. First, as I just noted, this week USCIRF is issuing our annual report that contains extensive policy recommendations on how the U.S. can further freedom of religion in 25 countries. Second, today marks the end of the tenure of several commissioners who have labored mightily in support of religious freedom. We are most grateful for their efforts and dedication. They are Dr. Don Argue, Felice Gare, Dr. Richard Land, Dr. Elizabeth Padromo, and Nina Shea. Our other colleagues who diligently share the Commission's responsibilities, Aziza Al-Hebri, Reverend William Shaw, and Theodore Vandermeed, will miss those whose terms are expiring today, but look forward to the President and Congress promptly appointing new commissioners who will continue the institution's important work. As you know, the U.S. is engaging in conflicts against violent religious extremism. In this context, we can see just how much religious freedom matters, particularly in South Asia. Clearly, its absence fosters extremism and violence, increases instability, and encourages human rights violations. Research indicates that the protection of religious freedom correlates with reduced conflict and is critical to security, democracy, and socioeconomic progress. The national security implications of religious freedom violations are blindingly obvious, as we see in a March 15th New York Times article about Afghanistan. The article highlighted the stark difference between Afghans and Americans in reaction to the Koran burnings, which amongst Afghans triggered a greater reaction than the recent murder of their 16 fellow citizens. Looking back over the tensions in the U.S.-Afghan relations that have been simmering, the writer of the article noted that there is a fundamental disconnect between Americans and their Afghan partners, and it is rooted in our foreign policy having failed to take account of how, quote, faith is paramount for Afghans. By any measure, across most of the world, including South Asia, religion does matter, as does religious freedom, and when we downplay this reality, we do it at the cost of our foreign policy agenda, from human rights to national security. Because of USCIRF and mechanisms created by the International Religious Freedom Act, I believe we have the capability to rectify this. With that in mind, I will now turn to Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and briefly Bangladesh. Since 2002, USCIRF has recommended that Pakistan be named a country of particular concern, but the U.S. State Department has yet to take that action, even though Pakistan both engages in and tolerates severe religious freedom violations. In Pakistan, growing religious extremism continues to threaten religious freedom and related rights, especially for women, religious minority members, and Muslims who hold views that extremists deem un-Islamic. The mere allegation of blasphemy has resulted in the lengthy detention of and violence against Christians, Ahmadis, Hindus, and members of the Muslim majority as well. Let me say a few words about Shahbaz Bhatti, Pakistan's former federal minister of minority affairs, who was murdered for opposing Pakistan's blasphemy law. Today, over a year later, Pakistan's government has done virtually nothing to investigate the crime and bring the perpetrators to justice. Pakistan must bring them to justice so that every Pakistani knows that perpetrators of violence will be held accountable and that individuals can stand for freedom without forfeiting their lives. Bhatti was a Christian, but violent extremists recently have targeted members of other religious minorities. Last September, for example, militants stopped a bus of Shia Muslim pilgrims near Quetta, shot and killed 26 of them, and later killed 3 relatives when they tried to collect their bodies. Other religious minorities, like Pakistan's Hindus and Sikhs, are especially vulnerable to crime, including robbery and kidnapping for ransom. Ahmadis are subject to the most severe legal restrictions, officially sanctioned discrimination, and acts of violence. Designating Pakistan as a country of particular concern would be a critical first step in a constructive direction. The U.S. government should urge Pakistan to align its laws with international human rights standards, actively prosecute violence perpetrators, and unconditionally release individuals currently jailed for blasphemy. Equally important, as noted by a study we released last November, Pakistan's educational system, public and private education alike, needs to be addressed as an incubator of extremism. Pakistan must set national curricula standards that promote tolerance, introduce a course to promote interfaith understanding, and sign into law and implement a madrasa reform agreement. I wish to submit, Representative Pitts, this November report, along with my testimony for the record. As with Pakistan, religious freedom conditions remain poor for its neighbor, Afghanistan, which is why, once again, we named Afghanistan to our watch list. In Afghanistan, individuals who dissent from the prevailing Islamic orthodoxy are subject to legal actions, including prosecutions for blasphemy and apostasy. Moreover, Afghanistan's constitution has been interpreted and applied in a way that elevates a restrictive interpretation of Islamic law. Given that the Taliban's influence will likely rise if negotiations with insurgents move forward, this is increasingly problematic. The problem is that the Constitution's undefined notions of Islamic law supersede its human rights guarantees, undermining religious freedom and women's rights. Unfortunately, President Hamid Karzai recently expressed support for a document issued by Islamic scholars which promotes segregation of the sexes and allows husbands to beat their wives. The small Afghani Christian community is also vulnerable. In recent years, arrests have spiked, with Christians being jailed but later released for the so-called crime of apostasy. In response to conditions in Afghanistan, the U.S. government should clearly state its concern for guarantees ensuring religious freedom and religious tolerance. It should create a special interagency working group on religious freedom in Afghanistan and co-sponsor with the Afghan government an initiative on interfaith dialogue and religious tolerance. The U.S. government, if it resumes negotiations with the Taliban, needs to make adherence to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights under the Afghan Constitution as an explicit plank in the negotiations. And the State Department should at least consider pressing the reset button on its informal justice system training program, which seems to be resulting in the application of some radical interpretations of Sharia in parts of the country. Turning to India, we have again placed that nation on our watch list. India has been slow in achieving justice for serious attacks against religious minorities, including Christians in Orissa in 2007 and 2008, Muslims in Gujarat in 2002, and Sikhs in 1984. Intimidation, harassment, and occasional violence against religious minority members have continued, highlighting how delays in justice have encouraged a climate of impunity. Today, 10 years after the killing of between 1,200 and 2,500 Muslims, as well as Christians, and the displacing of 100,000 people in the state of Gujarat, hundreds of court cases remain unresolved. USCIRF has recommended that the U.S. government integrate concerns for religious freedom into all bilateral contacts with India. We've urged the Indian government to strengthen the ability of state and central police to prohibit and punish cases of religious violence, and we've urged the Indian government to encourage states that have adopted anti-conversion laws to repeal them, because we think those are creating violence within those states. Lastly, very few words on Bangladesh, which was on our watch list through 2008. After the 2008 general election, we were encouraged by Prime Minister Hasina's announcement that she would implement religious freedom reforms. We remain encouraged by recent steps to rectify past religious freedom violations, and we just recently spoke with the Bangladeshi ambassador about those. In December 2011, the Bangladesh cabinet passed the Vested Property Return Act, which established a process for the return of or compensation for property seized. That is a positive development. However, this process is available only for citizens residing in Bangladesh, and we've asked that they consider extending the protections, and we'll, of course, continue to monitor what goes on in Bangladesh. To conclude, Representative Pitts, let me just say that religious freedom abuses must never go unchallenged. in South Asia or anywhere else in the world, as I know you believe as well. I commend the Tom Lantos Commission for its determination in this regard, and I thank you again for the work you're doing in this area and for having me testify today. I look forward to our continuing work together on behalf of human rights and religious freedom.
Chair, thanks the gentleman, and we'll, with your permission, begin the questioning, and I'll recognize myself for that purpose. First off, I appreciate your mentioning that it is the policy of the United States to encourage respect for human rights and freedom of thought, conscience, and religion around the world, and that statement could not be more accurate. That being said, how do you rate the U.S. government's effectiveness in promoting religious freedom and protection for religious minorities in South Asia, and what should we be doing that we're not doing?
I think that the U.S. government's record in this regard is rather mixed. Clearly, we have tried to have some interventions with the Pakistani government and to some degree with the Indian government regarding some of the issues I've mentioned, but far little has been done to date. Pakistan should have been placed on the country of particular concern list at least a couple of years ago, and certainly the assassination of Minister Bhatti and Governor Taseer sent a real warning light or red flag in the air that things were getting worse. We've noted in some recent work we've done that over 100 people have been imprisoned under the blasphemy law for Pakistan, and these just aren't religious minorities. These are majority Muslims as well who are sometimes targeted by their fellow citizens. In the case of Afghanistan, we have very serious problems, Representative Pitts, because I think in part a number of years ago, the United States helped with a constitution that contains some very troubling provisions. In particular, there is a repugnancy clause in the Constitution of Afghanistan that basically says that anything in contravention of Afghanistan's radical interpretation of Sharia and Islam is superseded. So any references right now to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights contained in the Afghan Constitution are subject to being superseded by the repugnancy clause. This is something that unfortunately occurred on the United States' watch early on in discussions with Afghanistan. It is something, though, that we can correct today. If, in engaging in negotiations with the Taliban, we urge them to embrace respect for the Universal Declaration and reject its current interpretation of the repugnancy clause in the Constitution. So there are more things that we can be doing. I think the United States needs to recognize the centrality of freedom of religion or belief to our foreign policy and national security agenda. We don't always do that to the extent we should in countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Based on your assessment of the lack of redress for the victims of the Gujarat violence, and I might say I visited Gujarat shortly after the 2002 riots. I visited the home of the Member of Parliament, Mr. Jaffrey, where some 72 women and children had fled, seeking refuge, thinking they would have refuge there, and witnessed the blood spattered on the wall where they had been violently killed and burned. It was just horrific. In your opinion, what can the U.S. government do to urge the Indian government to take a more serious look at this issue? I don't think there have been any prosecutions. Is that what you said? Would you elaborate?
Well, there have been some investigations and prosecutions under the fast-track courts that India has created. The problem is that these courts are moving at an incredibly slow pace. There are a lot of questions about whether investigations are being dropped that shouldn't be, and there's very limited public information about how these investigations and prosecutions are going. There's a disproportionate number of judges and law enforcement officers to the size of the population, which slows the justice system down even more. So there's a tremendous sluggishness in dealing with the problems in Gujarat and Orissa. And on top of that, to some extent, there's a loss of some public confidence. because you have, for example, government leaders like Manoj Pradhan and Narendra Modi, both of whom were implicated in the violence, and they still maintain their positions in government, even though Pradhan was convicted of culpable homicide, multiple counts of it, and even though Modi is believed to be complicit in the violence. So, number one, you have a justice system that's just really not adequate to address the problems, and secondly, you have a loss of public confidence because people who were quite likely involved in some of the violence that occurred are not being removed from government and brought to justice.
Would you be supportive of the potential reiteration of the U.S. State Department's past refusal to provide Chief Minister Modi with a visa to visit the United States?
Yes, we would.
Yeah, and on a subsequent visit there, I met with the Muslim community. We were part of a ceremony giving keys to homes, small homes, and sewing machines, you know, to the widows. Many of the widows in that community. Is there more that the United States should be doing to help engage on that issue?
Well, this is one area where the Indian government has started to do some good work. So they are providing some compensation for the rebuilding of homes and businesses. Unfortunately, it's a fraction of the cost to rebuild, so it's unclear how effective that assistance is going to be to the people who have been beleaguered by the violence. I think there are a couple of things the United States can do, which the Commission has recommended. I mean, first, we can provide some capacity building and technical assistance to bolster the law enforcement system in India, and because we have a rich tradition of the rule of law here, we've got some very good training programs. We should bring those to bear in India because they could be helpful. Secondly, I think we have to continue to place pressure on the Indian government to really move forward faithfully in trying to compensate as many victims as possible. And look, we all recognize that there are systemic problems in India with their justice system, and of course there are huge economic pressures on the country. And so we need to recognize that it's not an easy task. But at the same time, we need to try to convince the Indian government that tensions regarding freedom of religion and religious minorities are a real tinderbox and could create enormous instability. So although there are systemic problems, addressing this particular one ought to be a priority, and that ought to affect the way in which funds are allocated and the justice system's resources are allocated as well.
Moving back to Pakistan, regarding USERF's study on the public schools and madrasas in Pakistan, I found your comments on education reform interesting. What can the U.S. government do to encourage the Pakistani government to set standards for their textbooks?
Well, first of all, I think the United States has to use the bully pulpit a little bit here. There is strong evidence that the development and exportation of extremist ideology, the likes of which we see in the Pakistani curriculum, creates enormous instability and insecurity, not only within the country where it's being developed, but also outside the country where some of this material is being exported. So in the case of Pakistan, for example, Representative Pitts, when we were in Nigeria, we were told by the State Security Service in Nigeria that they were finding extremist Pakistani literature in the northern states of Kano and Kaduna. And so Pakistan's educational system and the materials that they're producing are having fairly widespread implications. So number one, I think we have to engage the Pakistani government and explain that this is no longer just an internal affairs or domestic matter. This is a matter of national security to the United States. We can't have Pakistan educational system producing extremist materials that are creating the kind of violence that we're seeing in Nigeria with the terrorist group Boko Haram, and in other countries also. Secondly, this is really a governmental issue, because there are I think over 100 private madrasas in Pakistan who would love to change their curricula if they only could. But the only way they can is if the Interior Ministry changes some of the regulations that are currently in place. So by the United States using its bully pulpit and standing up strongly, what we're doing is we're helping to reinforce the desires of those private madrasas to change their curricula. And then finally, what I think the United States could be doing is engaging other world partners in the EU and elsewhere on putting pressure on the Pakistani government to change its educational system. We've engaged, for example, the Bundestag and the national security component of the Chancellery in Germany on Pakistan issues, and we think that the U.S. government, the State Department in particular, needs to engage Germany and other partners in putting pressure on Pakistan. I think if some of those things happen, you may see at least some trends in the right direction, because on one or two occasions the Pakistani government did do some things to try to improve the educational system. So I think with more pressure they might move further along.
And on the issue of Minister Bhatti, did you say there's no efforts at all to prosecute at this point? Are they investigating? What's the status of that case?
There hasn't. Our understanding is that there's an investigation and that some people may have been identified, but there's certainly been no prosecution, and it's been over a year. My suspicion is that there is tremendous fear and trepidation about moving forward with any such prosecution, because extremist elements in Pakistan, would potentially do more violence in their communities. And of course, one has to recognize that there is that risk. But at the same time, if you time and again refuse to investigate and prosecute these kinds of acts of violence, especially in the case of a high-profile individual like Shahbaz Bhatti, you create no disincentives for violence in the future. And so I think at this point the Pakistani government just has to, bite the bullet and move forward with an aggressive prosecution of the perpetrators of the violence. There was ample evidence, at the crime scene and elsewhere, that with some good law enforcement capacity, which they have and which certainly other countries can help them provide if they need it, the people who really committed this heinous act could be found and punished.
Thank you very much for your testimony, for answering our questions. We really appreciate your leadership on this matter.